Hi, you guys. Welcome to History of Thought 2. And today we're going to be talking about Friedrich Nietzsche. So, Nietzsche, born in 1844, died in 1900, is probably one of the most controversial and misunderstood theorists of the past 200 years. He was personally not a nihilist. He was not a complete moral relativist, although he is often mistaken and read as both of those things. He was also not an anti Semite. He was vocally critical of the anti Semitism that was gaining a lot of strength in the late 19th century in Europe. But his sister was an anti Semite and German nationalist. And after his death, she reworked his unpublished writings to fit her own political beliefs, which were fascism and Nazism. Nietzsche himself sort of predicted that, quote, terrible things would be done in his name in the future. And I think he was kind of right. By the 1960s, though, scholars had recorrected his works that his sister had sort of edited inaccurately and reinterpreted Nietzsche in a much more positive light. So now he is popular not just with philosophers, but with everyday people who want to contemplate the meaning of life in a more radical fashion. Nietzsche, as you will find out, is very difficult to read because he's constantly asking us to overturn what we see as sacred and what we see as given. Kind of the ideas of the Enlightenment of question everything and have courage to use your own reason. Nietzsche is going to push that to the extremes and have us push that to extremes. What are the things even sort of 100 years, 150 years after the Enlightenment are we not questioning? And he's going to push us to question those. However, he does see many humans as weak, right, as sheeple. He didn't like democracy. That also is kind of hard to stomach with him. But he also sees in everyone the kernel of possibility of becoming the Übermensch, the Superman, the next stage in human evolution. For Nietzsche, the task of philosophy is to help us become who we really are. But unfortunately, most people aren't going to be able to do it. So, what we are going to do at the beginning of next class, so I just want you to think about these briefly for now. We're going to talk about these issues. So, maybe just think for a minute before you connect with Nietzsche, before you read anything about Nietzsche, before you listen to anything about Nietzsche, think about what are some of the morals and values that guide your life. And do you think everyone should follow these same morals and values? And also think about what constitutes the good life for you. If you can imagine a happy and fulfilling life for yourself, what would it look like? So, maybe pause, take a few minutes, write down your answers to those things and then come back to the lecture, okay? So one of Nietzsche's most famous sayings that he's often associated with is the idea that God is dead. So what does he actually mean by this? Is he happy that God is dead? Is he rejoicing it? Is he worried about it? Really what Nietzsche is doing is he's kind of identifying and describing what he sees as the increased secularism in the West, the decreased sort of religiosity in the West, associated with the rise of the Enlightenment, the decline of superstition, the rise of science and the scientific method, right? He's seeing, kind of the decline of people who are devoutly religious, especially in kind of the dogmatic, don't question religious authorities sort of way. So is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And I think this is really encapsulated in Nietzsche's Parable of the Madman, which is one of your assigned readings from Nietzsche. Okay, so this is the Parable of the Madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Immigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you, you have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from the sun? Whither it is moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from the suns? Are we not plunging continually backwards, sideways, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as though an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as of yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement or sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of the deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whomever is born after us for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. The deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo, led out and called to account. He is said always to have replied nothing but, "What after all are these churches now, if they are not tombs and sepulchres of God?" So what in the world is going on in this section? The madman is addressing modern people. I mean, this is sort of the late 1800s, but, modernity, modern people who are already non-believers. They've already sort of lost their religiosity. And they're mocking the madman and laughing at him. Lots of people, obviously, throughout history have argued against the existence of a higher power. Like, Nietzsche's not new in this. But this is a huge debate in the entire history of philosophy and religion and human society. But Nietzsche's actually saying something a little differently. Yeah, I just realized. Sorry, you guys, I just realized that my video in the corner was kind of cut off, so you can see my whole head now. Anyway, but that's Nietzsche's saying something just a little differently than sort of his argument of no higher power, which again is not like that. That argument has been going on since human existence. He says we haven't really fully come to terms what the death of God means for our society. We haven't really come to terms what the rising secularism of modernity in the West actually means. What are the repercussions of this? God and the Judeo-Christian religious tradition was the basis for all of our values in Western societies for, thousands of years. Even our basis for truth and evaluating truth. So ethics, morality, and truth. Nietzsche is an atheist, so this isn't 100% negative for him. And, he would even kind of begrudgingly say that Christianity gave lots of people meaning and allowed them to live live through pretty miserable existences, right? Being a peasant in medieval Europe is a terrible existence. Having religion and believing in something beyond yourself, allows, regardless of the truth claims of those religion, allows, you to tolerate that life. Religion allows people to deal with suffering, and it gave meaning to suffering in a way that Nietzsche will argue, which we'll talk about in a minute, ultimately is holding humanity back. But almost all of the thousands of other religions and philosophies and belief systems throughout human history that have helped humans deal with questions are about sort of the meaning of life. Why do bad things happen? Why do we suffer? Why are we here? So what Nietzsche is saying is in modern times, a lot of people have given up on God and religion and a lot of these belief systems that address the meaning of life and help us answer these questions. Especially, let's say, more traditional or fundamentalist versions of Christianity were definitely on the wane in Europe. But we have kept much of the morality based on Christianity. A lot of our moral systems in the West are just sort of Christianity light, and even if they're secular, the do unto others, turn the other cheek, this sort of thing. So what Nietzsche is saying is, what does it mean when we become sort of unmoored from these beliefs and these religious traditions that have kept us anchored morally and ethically in the West? What does it mean that we've dispensed with them? And what Nietzsche is saying is that we've kind of put this stopgap in place where we've still, even if society has become more secular and a lot less religious, we've still held on to a lot of the moral principles based in religions like Christianity. But eventually, he says, all of this morality has to be questioned too. And from his perspective in the late 1800s, this has not happened yet. So, what is the true meaning of the death of God? What will happen when we actually understand what has happened? When we actually understand the repercussions of dispensing with Christianity in the West and dispensing with sort of anchoring our morality in religion? And Nietzsche fears that we're all going to, in the West, plunge into nihilism. So nihilism is a philosophical view that life is without objective meaning, purpose, or any kind of value. Often it's seen as leading to a kind of despair or a sense of pointlessness in existence. So Nietzsche sees modern Western society as starting to become nihilistic in his lifetime. And this is over 100 years ago. This is like 130 years ago. So the loss of religion, and then eventually even the loss of sort of the morality that we have associated with this religion, will leave us morally adrift with nothing to anchor ourselves to. And he predicted this would actually happen in Western society for at least a couple of hundred years as we struggle with what the death of God actually means for morality and our moral system. So Nietzsche is not a proponent of nihilism, but an observer of it. He thinks it will be inevitable. I mean, he's actually against nihilism personally. He sees this as what weak people will do. And we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the class when we talk about postmodernism. But, kind of a moral relativism where there is no morality better than one another and we all accept all morals as equal. Sometimes that moral relativism is associated with Nietzsche, but that's not really what he's arguing for. He's kind of afraid of that happening. So what new values should we develop after the death of God? Nietzsche sees his overall philosophical project as the complete reevaluation of all human values and sort of trying to figure out how we navigate and how we get through and maybe even avoid this nihilism, which he is really pessimistic about and thinks is going to happen anyway, but he's still going to try. But what Nietzsche is not going to do is tell you what those values should be. He's not going to say, here's the Nietzsche moral system that you should replace Christianity with or nihilism with. No. And he isn't going to argue whatever we replace, whatever our next sort of moral system is in the West. He's not going to say that this new system should somehow be universal or transcend time or space. Even it is relative to a particular historical context. But it's a project, this sort of reevaluation of our values and redevelopment of our values and ethical system with the metaphorical death of God. It's a project we all must face and engage in. Although, according to Nietzsche, most people won't be able to do it. So he's not very optimistic about sort of the power of most people to do what Kant called us to do and have the courage to use our own reason. He sort of thinks most people are going to be lazy and full of cowardice, which Kant was a little more hopeful about, but not Nietzsche. Nietzsche's like a really pessimistic Kant. So, hold on. So another important concept of Nietzsche's is the will to power. And this really connects a lot to sort of his philosophical project. So we're going to talk about it in a little bit of um, detail. So Nietzsche sees power as the main driving force in humans, but it might, you might want to take a minute and think about what is power. A lot of times we think about power as sort of force, right? As maybe being able to get somebody to do something that they otherwise wouldn't want to. We kind of think of power in sort of a negative sense. The dictionary definition is the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others in the course of events. But Nietzsche's conception of power is a little different than the standard definition. Nietzsche means sort of achievement, ambition, and the striving to reach the highest possible position in life. Nietzsche would say it's sort of power, and the will to power is sort of the ability to become your true self, being able to realize who you really are. And that could be a super rich tech entrepreneur with all of the trappings of a contemporary, being wealthy in a contemporary capitalist system, or it could be in a hermit in the woods with only dogs and books as companions. It's about being able to achieve what is your authentic self for Nietzsche. If there's anything like a belief in human nature in Nietzsche, which there really isn't, but this is it, right? This idea of the true self or the authentic self. So, how are we able to achieve this, and what usually gets in our way? So what gets in our way is uncontrollable external circumstances, right? So you want to be a giant tech entrepreneur, but there's a giant tsunami that wipes out your office, right? But really, what usually gets in our way is the wills and struggles of other people. Because there might be thousands of other people who want exactly the same thing we do and are struggling for it, and we all can't have it. So Nietzsche sees human existence as a struggle between different human wills for power or for their desires to be their authentic selves. So throughout human history and human society, we constantly observe humans competing with one another for the main purpose of feeling superior to one another. Why? For Nietzsche, it is this will to power, which in actuality drives varying conceptions of morality. So Nietzsche would say, there's this famous phrase, history is written by the victors. Nietzsche would say morality is determined by the victors. So, what does morality look like for Nietzsche? How should we live our lives? From his perspective. And he's not going to tell you how to live your life. He's going to kind of give you a pathway for figuring it out. So what happens in our culture when we really deal with this sort of metaphor, the death of God? And I want to be clear. I think we can think of this, he's not saying that all of a sudden a bunch of people stop believing in God. I mean, that does happen. That happens in the West quite, a lot, the religiosity is down. But also just kind of this very, let's say, fundamentalist version of Christianity where you do exactly what authorities tell you and you don't deviate from it. That even for believers, that kind of sort of medieval Christianity just doesn't exist. I mean, yes, of course, there's some fundamentalists, but if you kind of look at Western culture in general, it's a very secular culture and it's a very flexible culture when it comes to religion. And it's a very kind of individualistic, especially in America, view of religion, right? You can be sort of a proponent or a member of a certain congregation or church or belief system and not 100% subscribe to everything and sort of question aspects of doctrine and still feel very much a part of a faith community. And that's something that would not have happened in medieval Christianity. So that's what I mean by metaphorical death of God, this sort of waning of the absolute authority of the church and religious authorities, and sort of the morality that isn't 100% invested in sort of the church saying this is what's good and this is what's bad. So what does it mean when we deal with this kind of metaphorical death of God? And so for Nietzsche, we need a complete reevaluation of our system of morality in the West. And for him, what we need to put in its place is a system of morality that celebrates life rather than putting suffering on a moral pedestal. And more on this when we talk about the genealogy of morality. So Nietzsche is not developing a general system of morality that others can adopt. So he's not saying this is the general system that we should adopt. Rather, he's giving a framework to each of us to attempt to do our own thinking on the question. So for Nietzsche, there's an emphasis on our own free wills. We should be the higher judges of ourselves than any kind of external moral code, be it religious or secular or whatever, that we must create our own moral values and moral codes for ourselves. And this is based on a lifetime of rational reflection. He is extremely skeptical to any kind of call for universal morality. So a moral system that applies to all people at all times and all places. So, this is part of his skepticism about religion, but also other kinds of moral systems. Because for Nietzsche, sort of morality and the demands of morality can change over our lifetimes as our lives and our circumstances change. Nietzsche himself personally valued health, vitality, creativity, the arts and culture, independent thinking. And if he has any kind of central ethical picture, it's about the affirmation of life associated with these things. I think I heard one philosopher say that happiness for Nietzsche is best put by happiness as realizing your talents. And so that really for Nietzsche is what he values personally and is central to sort of his moral principle. So for Nietzsche, he thinks that we equate the good life in modern times. So I asked this question at the beginning about the good life. What is happiness? What is the good life? What should be our goals in life? In modern times, we often equate that with lack of suffering, right? Being content, living without conflict or stress or pain. Nietzsche's like, no. He calls this herd happiness. So Nietzsche sees suffering as a part of life and central to a great life. That overcoming suffering is what makes certain individuals become better people. So if happiness is realizing your talents, this is for Nietzsche. This actually comes from sort of ancient Greek philosophy. He likes certain aspects of ancient Greek philosophy. Realizing your talents, it's not something you just wake up and do the day you're born or even when you're 5 or 20. This often involves facing hurdles and challenges, which often means experiencing suffering, right? We need to seek challenges, even if this means hardship and pain, even if we fail, in order to become the best versions of ourselves that we can be on our own terms and according to the moral systems we develop for ourselves. So this is Nietzsche's version of the good life. Very much kind of connected with this is his concept of amore fati, right, which is love of fate. And so Nietzsche is asking us to live your life so that you have no regrets. In other words, so you come to the end of your life and you could say, I would do that all over exactly the same again. That is what Nietzsche wants us to do. And he would say, if you come to the end of your life and you'd say, well, I do all of that differently, then why aren't you changing things now? Why aren't you living your life in a way now so that at the end of it, you won't have regrets and that you live your life so that you would be happy living the same life over and over and over and over again. That's what Nietzsche wants us to do. And if we're not, he's going to push us to constantly ask why. Why aren't we living our life that way? And, most people aren't going to because they're sheeple for Nietzsche. So most people obviously won't be able to do this, right? And this is why Nietzsche doesn't like democracy. Because he doesn't see most people as sort of capable enough to sort of, live their lives in this sort of affirming way, free of kind of caring about what other people think and free of sort of commitments to other authorities. In other words, this really goes back to Kant and what is enlightenment. He doesn't he doesn't really see, Kant at least sees that there's this gradual kind of enlightenment process that could happen. And Nietzsche's really skeptical. He wishes it would, but he's really skeptical that most people are capable of doing this. So one of Nietzsche's most kind of misunderstood concepts is the idea of the Übermensch. And you actually have a School of Life video about this. So I want to talk about this more in class, but I'm not going to explain it in much detail because I think the video does a great job. And this is where Nietzsche and sort of Nazism and fascism often get disentangled or entangled in eugenics. But we can kind of see in Nietzsche's own writings what he means by the Übermensch or the Superman. The Übermensch, the Superman, for Nietzsche, is the next stage of humanity. I mean, in a lot of ways, we could think of it as the next stage of evolution. What comes after humanity? As sort of, as our sort of ape ancestors are to us, what comes after us? What's the next stage in human evolution? What's the next stage of humanity? And the Übermensch for Nietzsche is kind of this metaphorical figure who goes through this struggle, this lifelong struggle to overcome these old, outdated human values, to overcome their own weaknesses, to suffer and sort of realize their talents and realize their true selves. Nietzsche kind of, the kind of people he identifies as being Übermensch are Napoleon, Julius Caesar, kind of Jesus, not whom Christianity made him into from Nietzsche's perspective, but sort of the historical figure. This is what we should be striving towards. And Nietzsche's saying we shouldn't mimic their morality or how they lived, because that would be being disingenuous to ourselves. It's more the authenticity, a true and authentic life as sort of self-overcoming. As Nietzsche famously said, your real self lies not deep within you, but high above you. So human existence for Nietzsche is a struggle between what he would sort of call our animal side, sort of the past stage of human evolution, and our Übermensch, our Superman potential. So why are most humans not able to do this in modernity? For Nietzsche, again, think about sort of the death of the traditional view of God, and for Nietzsche, humanity is kind of at this point in the West where we've thrown off the shackles of a lot of our previous belief systems, right? We've thrown off all these old authorities, including sort of absolute religious authority. And that was great about the Enlightenment, right? We've liberated ourselves from all of these old precepts and old ideas and old authorities. But holy shit, what does that mean? And for a lot of people, that means we can do whatever we want, maybe a hedonism, but also it can mean, well, there's no meaning to anything. Nihilism, right? And so he kind of seems skeptical that we're at the point yet that the next stage in human evolution is possible until we kind of get through that nihilist phase. But he wants to push at least those of us who he sees as capable, good old elitist Nietzsche, in the right direction. So that's it for Nietzsche part 1. So we sort of covered the idea of the parable of the madman and the real meaning of God is dead, and his sort of fear of nihilism, sort of his call to suffer and to struggle individually for each of us to kind of realize our own moral path and our own ethical system. But of course, most of us aren't going to be able to do this for Nietzsche, but he does see maybe kind of a glimmer of hope at some point in the future that there will be a next stage of sort of human evolution as represented by the figure of the Übermensch. So for the next lecture, we're going to talk about Nietzsche's specific sort of view of Christianity, which he really vehemently didn't like. But, I think maybe for a different reason that we might think Nietzsche is a lot more complicated, I think, than kind of the simplistic philosophy 101 view of Nietzsche. And hopefully, even though some of his ideas are really like, whoa, I think there's some good stuff in him that we can take away. And we can also see why he's been so enormously influential.